Partakers in the discussion are Matthew Boyse, a senior fellow at the Center on Europe and Eurasia at the Hudson Institute, a former deputy assistant secretary in the State Department. Thank you for being here with us. Ambassador István Gyarmati has fallen ill, unfortunately, but we're lucky and honored to have with us Rob Benjamin, Regional Director of the National Democratic Institute. And last but not least, Zsolt Németh, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the Hungarian National Assembly. It's good to have you with us. And the moderator is Piotr Kulczynski, the Council for Sponsorship Officer for the Permanent Secretariat of the World Summit of Nobel Peace Laureate. The floor is yours.
Once again, thank you. Microphone. Oh, yeah, sorry. I thought it's just such a nice room that we can not use it. Okay, thank you very much, Equilibrium Institute, for organizing this amazing format. It's a new event, and we keep fingers crossed that it will be continued next year and in the following years. Thank you, NATO Public Diplomacy Department, for being here and supporting this initiative. We are here to discuss the ways for Central Europe. Formally, Central Europe is also Germany, Austria, and some other countries, so I think we will focus mostly on the countries of our region as Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Poland, and perhaps also we can touch upon some other countries which are closely cooperating with us. I know that Mr. Boyse has some remarks prepared which are also concerning the US-Hungarian relations, so I think it might be a very interesting start for our discussion, and I would like to give you the floor first.
Thank you, Piotr, and great to be here. Yeah, so I got off the plane today, so I'm a little groggy. I teach, and I can't skip my classes for my students, but it's also nice to see some people in the audience, because whenever you're speaking last at a conference, the audience tends to be thinner and thinner, but they're here to hear Zsolt and to hear Rob. And it's also great that there is a conference like this in Budapest, because I must say that there are conferences like this in pretty much every Central European country, but not so much in Hungary. And so it's great that this is now I hope this becomes a tradition. So the subject is supposed to be the way forward on Central Europe, but I have permission from the organizer, Reika, that I can actually talk about the bilateral relationship, which is something that I was very involved with in my last job as responsible for Central Europe in the State Department and during the Trump administration. So I spent a lot of time thinking about it, and it was like a lot of time thinking about it. It's a minefield, and I've tried to avoid talking about it because whenever you talk about it, you get attacked from one side or the other, because this is a polarized issue, and people are also keeping score. But since we're in Hungary, and the bilateral relationship is very near and dear to me, and since the relationship is not where it could or should be, and since I spent a lot of time thinking about it, I thought it would, here we go. Those people in the United States who think about, I wrote this down on the plane last night because I have to I don't want to just talk off the cuff, because you have to choose your words carefully, otherwise you'll be attacked even more. So those people who think about the bilateral relationship with the United States, with regard to Hungary, of course, have very deeply set views on this, which is the case here, in the United States, it's here and it's elsewhere. The two countries remain allies, of course, and there are a lot of major, a lot of investments in the United States, U.S. investments in Hungary, and both sides have a lot of equities in each other's, just within the bilateral relationship. But politics and some foreign policy issues are getting in the way of making this relationship all that it can be. And so how did we get here? And so it's not a revelation to say that, that views vary significantly according to the political orientation, political party. On the Democratic side, they have a big problem with the Orban government, and are likely to have a major problem with the government of Hungary as long as its approach to a number of issues doesn't change. They show no signs of changing in course, although Rob can maybe correct me there, and so there's no surprises here. And the general narrative is that the government of Hungary is entirely responsible for the state of affairs. The Obama administration downgraded the bilateral relationship, which, after a positive chapter during the Trump administration, has only gotten worse during the Biden administration. And now, does this mean that the Hungarian government played no role in this downturn? No, it doesn't. It pursued policies that have really annoyed the Democrats and some Republicans for different reasons. And everybody knows what the issues are. But I would actually, I thought, what word should I use? During the Obama administration, when the relationship took a dive, there was a degree of arrogance that if I were a Hungarian, I probably would might have also reacted in a similar way. Now, of course, the Hungarian government takes exactly the opposite view. It blames the current situation entirely on the Democrats and its allies in Brussels, the legacy media, NGOs, deep state, etc. But as always, the reality is more complex than that, because both sides bear some responsibility for this state of affairs. It takes two to tango, and I've thought a lot about why we are where we are. And I had to deal with it on a daily basis in my last job, because we had one policy as a career diplomat. We had one policy that I pursued, and then we're being bombarded by people from the media and Congress who are upset about our policy, et cetera. So you have to deal with this stuff. And so, but I've come to the conclusion that on balance, it was probably the period during the Obama administration and then the Biden administration that it's during that time that the relationship fundamentally changed. And although the government of Hungary also played a role, both the Biden and Obama and the Biden public hectoring and vilification for more than 10 years, particularly on domestic issues, but not only, hardened the Hungarian resistance and reinforced their conviction that this was an ideological difference in addition to a policy difference, and that there was little prospect of returning to a traditionally close relations that had existed with democratic administrations. And of course, the government of Hungary's response was predictable. It pursues, modest bilateral cooperation. There are relations between non-government sectors that are quite robust and lively, but I don't really remember a time when they were actually sort of like really worse. Although I'm happy to be corrected. Now, there was a positive chapter in less acrimony and more cooperation, collaboration during the Trump administration, when relations were close and collaborative. But there were also differing interests at that time, some friction and some dissonance, as there always are between governments, by the way. And the Trump administration did not publicly rebuke Hungary as many wanted us to. And we dealt with whatever differences we had quietly and discreetly. Now, taking differences public is sometimes right, because we see what happened during the Trump period when he made an issue out of NATO 2%, which generated rather significant results, but even if it broke a lot of China. Because after all, the quiet diplomacy over the course of decades had not really led to much of a change in terms of many allies spending on defense. And of course, when you publicly admonish other countries, there was a certain amount of frustration in large parts of America that were, in fact, including parts of America that were actually quite very favorably disposed towards NATO, but they were sort of annoyed that many of our allies were not pulling their fair share. But as a Republican, as a recovering diplomat, experience shows that sometimes public reproach with allies can backfire, and it has here. It's not always the best way to deal with allies, treaty allies and partners and friends. And by the way, we also concluded that Hungarian domestic issues that many were criticizing were first and foremost issues for the EU to lead on, because after all, Hungary is an EU member state, and we aren't. And these issues are largely EU in terms of in EU competencies, although some of them, obviously foreign affairs issues are a little bit different. And the EU did virtually nothing for almost a decade. Now, if you look at the Republican side, for example, because you have to look at both sides, the approach to Hungary has been quite different. Most conservatives in the United States love the way that Hungary has taken on the woke and gender issues, the excesses of DEI, migration and strong borders, public safety, and family and cultural issues. And there's much interesting stuff there. But having been publicly criticized and vilified, Orban reacted as it might have been expected. He went where nobody criticized him, to Beijing and Moscow. Now, people may not know this, but the Trump administration took a harder line on the Communist Party of China than any administration had in years. And while the Trump administration was raising the issue of decoupling, or at least de-risking, the government of Hungary was doubling down on its relations with Beijing. You think of Huawei, you think of Fudan University in Budapest, you think of the Confucius Institutes, you think of major investments, it's rail lines, et cetera, and ties across the board. And meanwhile, the CCP was doubling down on its ties with Hungary, because seeing Hungary as the most amenable country to its interest in Central Europe, and one that would not ask embarrassing questions about the totalitarian state that it's built. So together they were building what they now call an all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership for a new era, a distinction that puts Hungary in a special category with Belarus, Russia, Venezuela, Uzbekistan, Ethiopia, Pakistan, and Zambia. And this caused concern in the Trump administration. And on Russia, the Trump administration was skeptical also of the International Investment Bank, the so-called KGB bank, with Box 2 nuclear deal, regular meetings that the PM and the foreign minister had with Putin and Lavrov, and negative media coverage of the United States, and more. Now, the Prime Minister and the President, Trump at that time, got along like a house of fire, but elsewhere on the political level, there were concerns. But then we raised them. There was always an explanation that included some version of, your country does this too, or so why can't we? And we're a sovereign country, and we always pursue our national interests, which one would expect from a sovereign country. But during the last 10 years, the Hungarian government has rolled out its foreign policy that goes beyond the conservatism of the first Fidesz government. And this unique approach that it has taken using concepts like connectivity and peace, et cetera, includes approaches that many conservatives have been scratching their heads about or do not think are great at all. And there are differences among conservatives, of course, on these issues, but the government of Hungary is resisting not only the left in the United States and the EU's ever deeper union and mission creep, et cetera, which many conservatives think is just fine, but they're also resisting issues that they consider the biggest problems facing the global West, i.e. China and Russia. So how should allies understand this approach? Now, I understand that conservatism's focus on sovereignty and I understand its focus on sovereignty and strong borders and traditional values. That's all very obvious. And if Vice President Harris wins in November, it's kind of hard to imagine that the relations are likely to improve. And it might even continue the downward spiral. Who knows? We'll have to see. But if Trump wins, then the relations will improve drastically and immediately. But the larger question remains what to do about China and Russia. And this is, there's a wide spectrum of views on this among American conservatives. Some like the Hungarian stance against the Russian war on Ukraine. They're tired of wars without defined end states. And President Biden hasn't really explained to the American people what that is. He hasn't really done a very good job of selling the American people his policy, having addressed them very, very rarely on this issue. And of course, there are some, you may have read some scandals that were involving members of his family receiving rather large amounts of money from Ukrainian oligarchs, and that sort of doesn't always look good to people who might otherwise be favorably disposed towards Ukraine, which is given the word Ukraine, which normally has a positive ring among US conservatives because they sympathize with those who suffered under Russia or Soviet or Russian domination, and negative connotation. And of course, and then Republicans also hear that Europeans say, well, support for Ukraine is an existential issue, which I think it is. But if that's the case, then they need to behave like it, and there needs to be less of a delta between, they need to sort of, with a few exceptions, they need to sort of put their money where their mouth is, as it were, and because they're not behaving like it as though it's an existential threat. And of course, American taxpayers can't want European security more than Europeans do. And these sentiments, unfortunately, feed the Ukraine skeptics. Now, there are many other conservatives in the United States who are growing increasingly concerned also with the direction of Hungarian foreign policy, not only because the European security order is facing its biggest threat in decades, but also because of the massive China and Russia problem. And these problems are connected. They affect US interests, and if Ukraine loses the war, or if Putin ends it on his terms, this will have negative implications for the United States, for NATO, and more widely, and this is dangerous. So I've heard all the arguments for why the Ukraine skeptic approach is the correct one. This is no time to address each of them here, we don't have it, but suffice it to say that upon examination, they're not persuasive in a geopolitical context. We are at a crossroads. This is a critical time in history when our societies must decide what side we're on. And there are powerful forces arrayed against the global West. Most of the governments on the eastern flank of NATO get that, but not everyone does. A specter is going through some Central European countries, the specter of defeatism. And if countries do not like the woke agenda, well, then they should fight it. And they should let themselves, they should not let themselves be used by those who want to replace the post-1989 order with something much less positive for freedom. Xi and Putin are leading some of these politicians around by the nose. And Putin, of course, finally discovered the issue of sovereign borders when the Ukrainian army went into the Kursk Oblast a few weeks ago. So whoever blames the war not on the invader but on the invaded, or not on Putin's lust for power and former Soviet territory but on Ukraine's desire to be part of the West, needs to ask, are Hungarians to blame for 1956 or the Czechs for 1968? The answer is very clear. The Kremlin's behavior was illegal and atrocious back then, and its behavior is illegal and atrocious now. And by the way, in no language is peace synonymous with surrender. So, anyway, is sovereignty synonymous with occupation? Those who argue that to stop support for Ukraine do not argue for peace. Their approach amounts to appeasement, or some worry about could be the peace of Bucha, because that was peaceful after the fact. So whom does this lack of clarity regarding these threats benefit? It benefits, I would argue, our adversaries, enemies, or whatever you want to call them, adversaries, enemies, the axis of aggressors. I'm almost done. Almost done. And the differences in the region over domestic and foreign policy play into their hands. They understand the fault line, the axis of aggressors, understand the fault lines in our society very well. China, Russia, and others have their number and are fanning these fault lines. They're being played. Many leaders in the region totally understand this, but others either don't or may not wish to understand what it really is at stake here. So in closing, this is not the time for ambiguity or both-sidesism. We cannot project weakness. Weakness invites aggression. The West needs to take clear stands. The threats we face now are different from and more dangerous than those in the past. We must see and acknowledge what is happening. Putin is a ruthless, revisionist, revanchist dictator and not a reliable partner. Xi is hardly different. And of course, politicians want to protect jobs, power their economies, and heat their homes. Of course, that's fine. But while gas is expensive, freedom is priceless, as one feisty lady from the Baltics once said. Putin alone is responsible for upending the European security order with ripple effects elsewhere. We must be clear what the consequences are if he wins, and they are very worrying, and he must be stopped. And I think conservatives also need to draw a line between their values and those of dictators who claim to be like-minded. They need also to defend the West, and I know this can be difficult, especially when parts of the West have adopted policies antithetical to those of the West. But rather than give up on the West and its institution, the answer is to work harder to make the West great again. And so here we are in Budapest. One final observation: the government of Hungary stresses it is part of the West and it wants to say Western civilization, which is wonderful, but sometimes it behaves as though the West is more of an enemy than the East. And I recently read a speech in the Tushványos that was given a few years ago, and when the Prime Minister had very little to say about Western civilization, and now is not the time to fixate on declinism, but to fight for a better version of the West, to strengthen the West, because the West is not only the woke agenda, intersectionality, and gender dysphoria, it's a lot more than that. And it would be great to see more of that rather than just criticism. So a number of political parties in Central Europe are playing into the hands of Beijing and Moscow, which is weaponizing and ruthlessly exploiting their concerns. Hungary still has a lot of friends in the West and is hot in parts of the political spectrum, but many friends in Hungary on the right are also scratching, friends of Hungary on the right are also scratching their heads, and Hungary risks losing them because of that. It is important to realize what is happening and to act accordingly. And I'm terribly sorry for the lengthy intervention.
Thank you for this very detailed analysis. I think now I should not limit the time of next speaker, so then we will finish after next two interventions. But I would like to go back to something more general, because we are talking about the region. We are talking what the region is, how the region was developing, what was in our region considered as a kind of move towards. Of course, we had this time when we were under communism, all the countries, and overthrowing communism was a common goal of the people who were in opposition to the governments in each country. Then, of course, we joined the West, and we wanted to be as close as possible. We wanted to implement several patterns from Western countries, of course, in collaboration with the United States and with the structures, with the institutions. We commonly joined NATO, and it was a great success of diplomacy working together, diplomacy of our countries. We joined European Union, and we established ourselves as let's say, grown-up democracies. Our societies started to develop. So. As I know that you also have a kind of prepared intervention, let me ask first Mr. Benjamin, who was helping us to develop civil society, who was helping us to bring those patterns, how democracy works in the United States, to say a few words about your experience in our region and your vision, how we were developing, how we were moving forward, and what could be the next step for us.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you this evening, and I want to thank the Equilibrium Institute for the kind invitation to join you for this discussion. It's very compelling for me, representing as I do the National Democratic Institute, NDI, which is a nonpartisan NGO supporting democratic processes around the world. It's very compelling to think about and talk about Central Europe with the legacy of Madeleine Albright, who, of course, served as U.S. Secretary of State and, with the support of many in the State Department, brought forward the process by which the countries of Central Europe joined NATO and were positioned to find their historical destiny in Europe with the European Union membership as well. And it's a powerful legacy, and I'm reminded as well of John McCain and the fact of his leadership in the Senate and his leadership as well as the chairman of the International Republican Institute, our sister organization, and my counterpart Paul McCarthy is here as well. And in that, I think, is a very emblematic demonstration of the bipartisan commitment and the full commitment that the United States has expressed to Central Europe, certainly since 1989. And I think that commitment holds now, all the more so because of the evident, if not existential, challenge that Russia's invasion of Ukraine presents. It makes the region, if you will, a front line in that conflict. And and it makes sense for the United States as a whole, and with bipartisan conviction to support Central Europe, not only because it's important for Ukraine, but for this region as well. And I take a lot of value in that. And I think we heard today from people like Phil Rieker expressing that very sentiment in the context of NATO, of collective defense and common security, and I think that's very powerful. It has to be, and I think it is predicated on fundamental values that are not political, and they're not necessarily ideological. They're based on democracy, they're based on human rights, they're based on the dignity of the citizen vis-a-vis the state, something that I think we all, in our own histories, understand, have lived, and embrace. Yes, it is probably the case that Secretary Albright would have raised an eyebrow or two or three over developments in Central Europe over the past decade or 15 years, but that should not be confused with the fundamental commitment that the U.S., I think, has for this region. But it's coming at a time, and I think a lot of the other discussions in this past day have given voice to the fact, it's coming at a time when we are really in a multipolar world. And there are not only security threats out there, there are offered alternatives to challenge not only the West, quote unquote, but the fundamental values that undergird our alliance. And we have to figure out a way to respond to that, not only in a security dimension, but in a political dimension, in an economic one, and come to understand that however imperfect democracies at least give the ability for people to engage. We won't really know how a country or a society like China engages on issues like corruption, because it really won't be publicized unless it's offered by the leadership, much the case in Russia. So there are challenges out there, and I think we just have to be thoughtful and strategic and remind ourselves of the essence of what brings us together. When you look at Europe now and you look at some of the political challenges that Europe faces, the economic challenges that Europe has, as evidenced in the elections around the continent, it is the case, I think, that people want in the United States to see in Central Europe a unity of purpose and a common cause that transcends political differences, that is responsive to the challenges presented in Ukraine, and that strategically sets up for a time when Europe as a whole and the United States and the NATO alliance can respond in the ways that the previous panel spoke of. I think that's possible. I really do. I think that's possible as long as we go to that essence of our fundamental values. And while there is, I think, a lot of questions to be asked about where the United States would go in an ensuing administration, I also believe that in the US, we have a kind of diffusion of power. It obviously rests in the White House, but it's also in Congress. Think tanks have a tremendous influence, I think, on policy, foreign policy. So there's an ability to find some measure of consensus. What would not be good is to look at in my view anyway, over-politicizing the relationship and on these fundamental questions of alliances and foreign policy. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Yes, I believe that in our region we've got this kind of attitude that whatever government says, the society thinks what the society thinks. So this kind of understanding between Hungarians, between Polish, Czech, Slovakians, and all the young people in European Union, because we don't really divide ourselves right now from young Germans, young French, and Spanish and Italian. So I think this kind of spirit is here. But talking about young people, we've got among us one of those who engaged himself in political changes in his country from the very beginning. You were one of the architects of Hungarian foreign policy. You were one of those who are serving in the parliament. I don't know if you are the only one who's serving in the parliament. 3 of you, okay, from the very beginning, from 1990. So this is really an honor for me to have you on our panel. And as we said, as you were kind enough to prepare some remarks concerning the cooperation in our region, cooperation between other countries, it will be our pleasure to hear it now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Piotr. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the Equilibrium Institute and to Réka Szemerkényi for inviting me and for bringing us together in Budapest. I was counting just now, and it occurred to me that around 30 years ago, Réka was knocking on the door of Fidesz International Affairs Cabinet, and we decided to employ her. And since then, I think we got to know her, and I don't think there are too many of you who would not. So we are very grateful to you for bringing us together today. And the Equilibrium Institute as well. Colleagues, I'm also very grateful for the explanation of Matt concerning his view on the Hungarian-American relations, because it was extremely interesting. I wouldn't say I understood each word what he said, because it was very quick for me, but I would like to read it. And I had the feeling that I agree with it, basically, what he said. And also, I am very glad that I'm together with a colleague from the NDI. NDI was the first organization turning up around Fidesz at the end of the 1980s. Tom Melia was doing it. And we have started to prepare for democratic elections and to build up a political future. I would like to talk now about two things. On the one hand, the concept of the Central European pathway, if it exists. On the other hand, how Hungary's role in building, maintaining this road may be affected by the debate that Viktor Orbán Tusványos speech this year has triggered in conservative circles about the Hungarian grand strategy, basically how this Central European relationship is influenced by Russia and by China. If we talk about way of Central Europe, we must take into account that Central Europe is not European Union, which has formal common decisions and therefore a formal common pathway. In Central Europe, only the nation states have decisions. They can point in the same direction. In such a case, we can talk about a Central European pathway. If they do not point in the same direction, then there is no common Central European pathway. Many of us believe that it is desirable for our geopolitical position to have common ground on as many issues as possible. But this is not granted, and if we want it, we have to work hard for it. The problem is, those who do not want a common road in Central Europe are also working hard. I don't want to be enigmatic. For example, Russian geopolitics is interested in Central Europe not being a political concept, not having common Central European roads unless they lead to Moscow. As the minutes of the 2023 Russian foreign policy strategy, which were intended to be secret but have been made public, clearly state, they are working consistently and persistently with hybrid warfare tools for this purpose. They are doing this against the whole of Europe, which of course includes Central Europe. If we want a common Central European pathway, we need to work more consistently and more persistently than them on our own Central European project. If we want to be successful, we must pay attention to each other's aspirations and determinations with great empathy, and we must find the common denominators or create a division of labor between our different policies, taking this into account. By building our relations with this caution, we can continue to build important, strategic, common Central European pathways. From this point of view, it is particularly worth paying attention to the Hungarian strategic debates on the pages of the journal Országút, partly on the Index News portal, and at the level of political statements. I am very glad that we have Mr. Jeszenszky with us. He has participated in this debate. These debates on the Hungarian grand strategy, going on since the summer, covers a wide spectrum of ideas, but culminates in two particular questions, the Russian question and the Chinese question, and now allow me to speak about this. On the one hand, the Russian question is about how and to what extent Hungary's relations with Russia are determined. On the other hand, it is about the price that the country, the nation, must pay for these determinations. Determination is, first of all, energetic. From this point of view, the recent metaphorical statement by the Foreign Minister, Péter Szijjártó, that if Russia turns off the oil tap today, Hungary will shut down tomorrow, is very important in the strategic debate. This is a strong argument for the fact that the grand strategy, if the country's sovereignty is to be considered a fundamental value, then by all means we must be aimed at the final elimination of such dependencies. In my opinion, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's latest statement about Hungary's energy neutrality should also be interpreted in this light. If the operation of the country can be stopped in one day following a decision in Moscow, then we have not been neutral until now. However, the strategy must aim to become so. I know you had a lot of discussion about energy in the last 2 days. A more complicated problem is the situation in Transcarpathia, which is currently not only a minority rights issue. Nobody in the strategic debate questions the value of Russia not bombing the province bordering Hungary, which is good not only for the ethnic Hungarians living there, but also for the Ukrainians and even for the Ukraine as a state. In many respects, Ukraine is making use of this potential, and rightly so. I am sure you are aware that the electric grid connecting Hungary, the pipelines, the gas pipeline, the oil pipeline, across Transcarpathia, how important it is for the Ukraine now. It's also a matter of determination that on the front of the war in Ukraine, the Russians kill ethnic Hungarians daily. Hungarians from Ukraine, who are just as Hungarians as us in Hungary. No wonder Hungary, for multiple reasons, is desperately interested in a ceasefire as soon as possible. Nonetheless, the strategy must take into account the fact that a kind of vicious circle has developed due to these determinations. And Matthew spoke about this, which are partly real and partly perceived. The essence of this is that Hungary is forced to maintain a certain degree of dialogue with Russia, which the Western mainstream media portrays as Russia friendliness, to which the Hungarians backfire, to which the allies take the action against Hungary, to which anti-Western sentiment in Hungary increases, which the West sees as justification for its actions against Hungarians, and so on and so on. And this suits Russia's divisive ambitions perfectly. It is true of our allies, as it is of us, that they are doing exactly what Russian policy, which seeks to divide Central Europe, wants them to do. Call it a vicious circle, or the Putin circle, the point is the same. To be able to talk meaningfully about a Central European pathway again, we need to break this vicious circle with strategic creativity and strategic patience towards each other. Patience is important. To paraphrase the proverb, strategic patience brings strategic roses. And finally, China. Another focal point of the Hungarian strategic debate is the Chinese issue. Can we benefit from the development of Asia, and especially China, and if so, at what price? Contrary to appearances, this question is not simply raised by admiration for China's catch-up in recent decades, or China's becoming a superpower, although there is undoubtedly such a thing. More importantly, I would draw your attention that after 2010, Hungary was able to break out of a deep economic crisis that developed in the first decade of the new millennium because China provided Hungary with a secure financial background without economic and social political conditionality. We could have received this background from international Western financial institutions only under counterproductive conditions that would have kept the country in the social economic crisis. And I would draw your attention that we have this conditionality from the European Union, and we don't have a single penny from them until now from our budget. In today's circumstances, the Hungarian economy needs a financial background again. It remains strategically important to get this without ideological pressure. China, together with some other countries like Japan, Qatar, continues to play a decisive role in this, as the agreements we signed during President Xi's spring visit to Budapest clearly showed. So, ladies and gentlemen, one of the key issues for the Hungarian grand strategy is to use this opportunity wisely. The dilemma is more or less this. Do we want to build a Western development with Hungarian characteristics on the Chinese financial base, with Western and Central European partnerships? Or do we want to use the Chinese lifeline to find a development model for ourselves that is different from our current Western character? We have a choice. China is not Russia, as it was said in the previous discussion. So it doesn't want to tear us away from the West. China is content if she has friends in the West. Hungary is going to have common decisions, and so a common pathway with other Central European states if in the Hungarian strategic debate those will prevail who say that we need to build a Western type of development with Hungarian characteristics involving Western and mainly Central European cooperation on the Chinese financial background. As Viktor Orbán said once, Eastern wind blows in the world economy, but we sail under a Western flag. These debates are not to be won by uttering theoretic principles, but by discovering and promoting actual Central European and Western American prospects of cooperation. I am asking for your participation in this. That is why I really appreciate our conference and your presence in Budapest, because exactly this conference is in the very best place, and I think in the best time, just before the American elections, when we might head towards a new beginning concerning the American-Hungarian and Central European relations as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you. When we are talking about the region, I think this region is built on some common values, but this region is also built on completely separated interests which each country has towards Germany, towards US, towards China. One of the questions here was if this divided region can reunite, if this divided region can act together. I think we are part of a larger structure, which is European Union. In terms of security, we are the part of larger structure as NATO. And of course, from the point of view of the citizens of our countries, we are very divided inside each country. So talking about region, talking about this kind of diversity of problems, it's really tricky, I would say. I wanted to ask our American friends about your opinion and your observation on this political division in each country of Central and Eastern Europe. Because, of course, we might say that in terms of international politics, we are divided. Hungary is quite an example of country with which the other neighboring countries are not always in agreement. But within every political election in our countries, we see that the society is really half-half towards some kind of, let's say, less democratic approach, and those who are more democratic, who are usually considered to be more pro-Western, pro-European. So if I may ask you, gentlemen, to comment on that, how from American perspective this kind of social political divisions are seen, and what can be the next step in some kind of rebuilding our relations, whoever wins the next election in US.
Just a very brief observation. It's a very good question. I mean, there are now. I mean, okay, we're in Budapest, so we understand the divisions in this country. We also, I mean, we see the same thing. I spent a month in Bulgaria this summer. Big divisions there. I mean, even between Euro-Atlantic parties. They can't get together. Czech Republic has some pretty big ones. Poland, the last election, very serious divides. Slovakia, really big divides. It's becoming. I mean, okay, having served at the embassy in Warsaw during the 1990s, I understood the difference between the post-solidarity political parties and those who were on the post-communist side, and that was a big divide. But that was started to kind of dissolve, or should we say it was less sharp, but that it's gotten sharper, these divisions over time, and they're crystallizing around certain issues which are some of them are cultural, social, kind of, you know, sort of more traditional ways of looking at the world or living versus some of the progressive ideas that are being that are so, you know, that are actually very present in also in these societies as well. So you got this like clash. So you've got, you know, some of the issues like the where does you know party X or politician X or Y stand on some of the litmus test issues like Russia. It will decide whether you're on this side of the fence or that side of the fence, and whether you can cooperate with them or not. And because these are, I mean, we may think this is these are just like why can't they just get along sort of thing, but these are, I mean, you know, it is easy to understand why this is happening even now. Even if we might wish that they didn't exist, like, you know, for example, in Bulgaria, why can't the two groupings form a government? Well, I understand very well why they can't form a government, unfortunately, but they're really hard. You don't have the same kind of political environment that you do in some other countries where there's a bit more compromise. There's a little bit more of a zero-sum game in some of these places, and then of course, so then you have cases where where then the governments in power who win then, I don't know, instrumentalize or weaponize or whatever else, or lawfare or whatever they do against their opponents, and then suddenly people lose their jobs who've been in their jobs through one change after another but who've been in the same job for 25 years, and then suddenly they lose their job because another team wins. And so this is not positive. I don't have a good answer for it, but you know, the IRIs and the NDIs who work with political parties every day in country, those are well suited, I think, to try to advance a greater culture of compromise and collaboration, even against the backdrop of all these really like litmus test issues. You know, I mean, we have it in two. You know, we have in the United States. You know, are you for abortion or are you against abortion? This is a big deal. You know, and this is a matter of conscience for many people. And you can't just sort of say, okay, you're a bad person because you believe this or that. You know, and but it sometimes takes on that element, and we unfortunately see it here too. I'm sorry for going on so long, Rob.
Yeah, basically, if we are so divided, can we be a stable partner for US?
Well, and vice versa. I mean, I think we're all living a moment of offset, really, of having a very defined binary, or sometimes not binary, polarizing environment, and I think that may speak to several long-term phenomena. you know, the 20th century, I think, established ideological bases for politics in left and right and center. And I think at home and perhaps in Europe, that is kind of giving way. There's a bit of an unmooring in terms of political identity and political affiliation. And that's maybe a good thing because our societies are evolving. We're a far more globalized place than we were 40 years ago. 1989 happened. I mean, we should be evolving. Our politics should be evolving. My concern is that rather than allowing for that evolution, we're trying to fixate and label in ways that are not necessarily helpful to find consensus or even to have discourse in the first place. The thing about the United States that I think we can fall back on in many respects is the largeness of our country, the vastness of our institutions. And by that I mean political and social, economic, academic, culture, popular entertainment, sports. We have, I think, a way to maneuver around and look at how we are arranging ourselves politically that gives us some room. We also have institutions of government that are sufficiently independent to adjudicate, and I think that's critically important. Those margins may not be as evident in Central Europe, both for size and for history and for all sorts of reasons. And so it may feel more extreme or more existential. The time frame that we're talking about, too, is now 35 years. And as you said, to go from a Soviet-imposed communism to a breakthrough or revolution, to then move quickly and ably to integration with Europe and the transatlantic community happens in retrospect so fast that perhaps societies were still trying to catch up with themselves and figure out their place. But I think if all of us can get to a place where we are looking to define issues in not so exclusive terms, then I think we can find our way to some dialogue that gives more flexibility to understanding positions, understanding people, and may provide a more flexible way to get at the very evolving identities that people have that may not be so ably defined by the traditional politics. But for Central Europe, I think there is a need to find unity. And I do think that the pursuit of incredibly important issues of national security and economy, like energy, have to be pursued with the national security interests in mind. And at the same time, there's a summons here for all of us to combat the forces that want to overturn by violence and destruction the order, as imperfect as it may be, but the order that has brought Europe to this place of peace and prosperity. And so there's a summons here that transcends, I think, that we have to pay attention to.
Thank you. We are behind the time, but one quick question. Because when we are talking about our region, there was one beautiful engine which worked perfectly and which helped us to join the NATO and European Union. That was the Visegrad Group. You were very enthusiastic about it. And I know that you are engaged for building this group, this kind of understanding between our countries from the very beginning. Do you think we can rebuild it within the structures of the institutions we are in right now as Union, as NATO? Do we have enough strength And energy, another use of word energy. Do we have energy in our government, in our societies, to think about our region as something which has those common values on which we can base future politics?
Thank you, Piotr. Just one remark about the situation internally of the West. So I don't think we in Central Europe, our societies would be more polarized and divided than the United States. So I think the United States is spearheading now the division inside the West, and we are just following what's happening over there. There is a copy-paste in Brussels, how they try to bring in these kind of divisions. And I'm a party politician. I'm a founding father of Fidesz 35 years ago, 6 years ago. So allow me to be a bit party political. However, I think bipartisanism and foreign policy consensus, especially in the field of security, is vitally important, and I think it is a real value. But we need to recognize that there is quite clear right direction reaction to the left polarization of American and European politics. And the creation of a new political party, Patriots, we are actively participating in the European Parliament, the strengthening of conservative parties all over Europe, and especially in the region, the strengthening of the social conservative values is an important tendency to pay attention to. And hopefully we will be able to build a kind of sovereignist transatlanticism, because basically the orientation of the sovereignist parties is Atlantic. Peace is not a question, or on our side there is no doubt about the importance of NATO and so on. So I believe that a sovereignist form of Atlanticism is in the coming. It is important to pay attention to, and I think it will be fundamentally triggered if Trump wins the elections in the United States, which we don't know, and we have to be prepared for an alternative scenario as well. It is the American citizens who will decide about that. And coming back to the V4 question, you know, I am a committed supporter of the Visegrad cooperation, and Minister Jasenski played a very important role in the creation of this cooperation. Lech Walesa, you had the message read out from him, and Václav Havel and József Antal were the three creators of this Visegrad collaboration. And I think this is a deep process. It is historical. It was first established in 1335. I would draw your attention by the Polish, the Czech and the Hungarian king at the time, and that was replicated in 1991. So there is a deep Visegrad, and on the surface we may have differences, but our economies, our societies, our infrastructure is growing together, and we belong together, and that's why we are growing together in this region. And the political class may have divisions. We may be a bit closer to the Slovaks, the Polish government may be a bit closer to the Czechs, but I would draw the attention to everybody that we have, all institutions are working, and there is a deep cultural, social and economic Visegrad, which will turn the attention of the politicians that we need to continue this collaboration. And I think the foundations are very strong, and I am optimistic about the future of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sorry that we're a little bit behind the time, but I think that was very interesting to hear your inputs to many issues we tackled during those 2 days of conference. So thank you again, organizers, for bringing us here together. I believe that we will meet again next year, because that's the plan, to organize the next conference in June, as I understand. May I ask you, Reka, to, or just, thank you, speaker. Thank you. Okay. So I shall just close the panel. Thank you.